Welcome. We're live now. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Breaking Culture Live. My name's Sean Johnson Andrews. I am the host. I'm broadcasting today from Chicago, and I'm really pleased to welcome back two guests that joined us on one of our first shows way back in October. Perry B. Johnson and Courtney M. Cox are directors of The Sound of Victory, which is an interdisciplinary initiative dedicated to exploring the historic relationship between music, sound, and sport. And they're also co-editors of a volume by NYU Press that's going to be published in August by that same name. They're here to discuss the politics of the NFL halftime show, which have been completely absorbing our popular culture for the past few weeks. And I'm sure have been completely absorbing your attention, especially over the past few weeks. Perry B. Johnson is a music scholar, cultural historian, and producer. Her primary research and practice focus on issues of power and identity through a critical examination of American culture and entertainment industries. In addition to her work on The Sound of Victory, she's currently producing the Arts Talk podcast of the USC Arts Now initiative, and is also the associate producer and co-host of the second season of Outside the Lyrics, an award-winning Emmy-nominated documentary series from PBS. She teaches at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California. So thanks for joining us, Perry.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Courtney M. Cox is associate professor in the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. Her research examines issues related to identity, technology, and labor through sport and wine. Her book, Double Crossover, Gender, Media, and Politics in Global Basketball, considers how Black women and non-binary athletes maneuver through the global sports media complex. And we'll have a moment to talk a little bit about that project, because I believe you're also doing some talks around that in the coming weeks. She previously worked for ESPN, the Longhorn Network, NPR affiliate KPCC, and the WNBA's Los Angeles Sparks. So welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm assuming you guys watched the halftime show.
Yeah, I heard there was a show. Someone perform? Was there,
yeah, I think there was I believe there was. And what a show it was. So at first I just want to kind of get your reactions to the official halftime show. Now we have to specify which one we're talking about. It's the official one I want to hear about. This is with the kind of most popular global artist, Bad Bunny. The word I've heard the most in descriptions is joyful, and that's certainly what I felt after I watched it. So what did you make of it?
Yeah, I think joyful feels right. I think intentional is maybe the word I would think about. We spent a lot of time. We've watched all of the Super Bowl halftime shows, and there are some that are less intentional in terms of production, in terms of content, in terms of organizing. Sometimes they're just kind of chaotic, like in a fun way. There's something I really love about these little concerts between two halves of football that are so fun. But intentionality is kind of where my brain goes to, of like people are digging into all the kind of pieces in this 13-minute block that seems so rich. So I think that's my word.
Yeah, I mean, Joy was all over it. I think on screen, he brought that to living rooms, to stadiums, watch parties all around the world. I think intentional is right. I think also it was well researched. I think well informed, and he's a world builder and a storyteller, and I think both of those things really came through. And he demonstrated what you can do with 13 minutes to activate different histories, different diasporas, all in a very short amount of time, in a way that lots of people found great joy in. And I've heard a lot of people saying it was so unifying, which it was not the term that was used in anticipation of his performance. So I think it was really well done from a production standpoint, and I think really intentional from a storytelling standpoint. So big fan. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, I was thinking about in one of the earlier discussions that I watched, where you all were talking about J-Lo's show, Perry. One of the concepts or the terms that you used was about the friction of translation and decoding on this stage. And I think that clearly this was an especially important example of that kind of decoding, and maybe also the friction. Obviously, it was in Spanish, but given that you all have studied so many of these, and really there's been 60, and you've been looking at all of them, right?
Yeah.
What do you see as sort of conventional in this show, and what's really unprecedented?
Translation, I think, is an interesting framing. I think it obviously has particular resonance with this show, given that it was entirely in Spanish, aside from Lady Gaga's unexpected cameo. So there's that sort of literal translation of language, which we can dive into. But what I will say to sort of situate this in the longer history of Super Bowl halftime shows is almost every year there are things that may not be readily apparent to lay audiences, even going back, I think, to early shows. That's only increased over the decades. But I think there's oftentimes what we might think of as layered layered
Mm,
meanings in every show, and there's what is sort of readily apparent or readily read in by audiences. And then there's all of the sort of Easter egg hunting that happens immediately after the fact. And I think that was certainly true. And what we've seen in the last, 72 hours since Bad Bunny, about folks wanting to know more and others
mhm,
reading pieces that are like, what's the breakdown? What's the breakdown? Obviously, we are one of many podcasts that are also doing this to try to unpack what's there. So I think in the larger historical context, have always been layers of meaning, and some of that requires a certain kind of translation work that isn't attached to language, but is attached to how we code meaning into certain symbols or cameos or set pieces that are a sort of, if you know, you know,
sure.
signals to particular audiences. We can certainly talk about J Lo and Shakira. I was rewatching the Dr. Dre halftime show with a class I teach on LA yesterday, and doing some of that unpacking work. Of some folks are like, "Oh, absolutely, this resonates," and other folks was like, "I had no idea Eve's After Dark was a place where Dre used to perform." So I think that is me just wanting to slightly put things into perspective, because I think there's been this like really grandiose language that's been thrown at and around Bad Bunny in ways that have attempted to radicalize it, sort of separate from the political histories that he's bringing to the show. But being the first halftime show that was entirely in Spanish, I mean, that was unprecedented. There'd been talk beforehand of are there or are there not going to be subtitles as part
Mm,
of that. I watched with a family friends that had captioning on it, but then the subtitles were giving you a somewhat complete Spanish to Spanish translation, right? Not a sort of a decoding in that way. So that's what I would say is toward translation, but Courtney may have other thoughts there.
I want to speak to maybe the expectations of a halftime show,
mm,
because we can watch them and kind of start to notice patterns. But I think maybe subconsciously folks may not understand that they have also built that expectation in of what they expect to see, the template, the format. And we've seen when people break that format. And sometimes these are about eras. We think about eras of the halftime show, which are about so often who's producing it and who's shooting it. There's a lot of longevity in terms of the production and direction of the halftime show, which is so lovely. We don't get that many places where you have the folks behind the scenes so consistent. But we think about like the MTV era where they wanted one of every genre. That became the expectation, is that you have 4 or 5 biggest stars in their genre all doing this mishmash, and then they do like one song together. And
mm,
so that builds an expectation. The singular superstar is an expectation. So anytime there's deviation from that, though, the unifying ballad that says some kind of general message about unity, right? These start to
sure.
become the templates where there has to be that upbeat, biggest hit start, and there has to be the slow thing that brings us down and eases us back into a second half of American football. And
Sure.
so whenever people step outside those bounds, there's always these reactions, and then it gets absorbed into the expectation. So when I'm hearing you, Perry, I'm thinking about even with the Dr. Dre set, having these big set pieces that represent real places, then because of a template that Bad Bunny lifts and can kind of take into taking us into Puerto Rico, right? Into a wedding, into the casita, like into the sugarcane, like these can all be places. So it's almost like when I watched the show, there was a translation piece of translating all the elements of shows before and kind of melding it into something really unique. And so there's part of me that just appreciated the research of like all these other shows and what had happened before. And then the storytelling, world building, as you say, like there's something about that is really rich, that's based on all these other big kind of set understandings that again, when people step out of that, the weekend had to because of COVID in 2021. I think about Rihanna pregnant and the way that that show came together. I think about the different ways people have played with having to get a set on and off of the field. So our lovely folks that became the Bushes.
Begin the
Were
Bushes,
also
exactly.
about
Yeah.
efficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much about the show that is so unique because of the expectations and also the logistics that I think Bad Bunny had to work around, but also really built up. That I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I don't believe I saw the Dr. Dre halftime, but is that so? One of the things that I was noticing, or one of the things I thought was interesting, was that especially the first few minutes where it's kind of just following him around in a really, I mean, and really throughout the whole show, it's very close to him, and you're kind of it's not that sort of epic view from afar. Which is where you usually get that sort of camera angle, right? Is the sort of like you're watching the entire field all at once. And there's some moments in this show where you get that kind of epic view, but mostly it was that. I mean, it kind of reminded me of the opening of like In the Heights, where you're kind of like following someone around the neighborhood, and they're singing while they tell you about their neighborhood, and that seemed very unique. But I don't know, was that similar to what was happening with the Dr. Dre, or was more the Dr. Dre was the scene? You saw the scene as a whole.
Yeah, I'm from a production standpoint, I'll speak to that. And then Perry might want to get into it and thinking about the content piece of like world building. But for me, typically when I'm watching halftime shows, I am, as someone that comes from a technical background in television, I'm always fascinated by the amount of logistics and camera work and how they were able to do this and where other people are at the same time, where the cutaways are. And so the thing that seems similar to me from the 2022 show, the Dr. Dre and Friends show at SoFi, was about when I saw Bad Bunny on top of the casita,
Mm,
on top of the house. It reminded me of Mary J. Blige. Is also, she does her entire performance up there. So we're on the ground, for example, when we have Kendrick Lamar, we're up. I also think about the casita, the dance scene. 50 Cent hangs down and does In the Club. And so the way that the dancers, the different set pieces, the different scenes all
mhm.
meld together. So when he falls through the ceiling, which is, I think, incredible from a technical perspective, when he falls through and then takes us through. So we're following with him, as you mentioned. But there's also, we get these big wide scenes where we start to realize the scope of where we are. And so I thought about that, of being up in different places when he does the trust fall down into the crowd, like
Yeah,
thinking about the logistics of how do you get around, and then how the music, when we're coming through and we're going through the taco truck, like when we're going through these different scenes and places, thinking about the cameras that have to follow, and then also the amount of people that have to also be set up for what's next. So my brain goes to like those logistics, because I think
sure,
2022 did some interesting stuff there for me that I think they learned a lot. So I think about this Apple Music Rock Nation era,
sure.
as this newest iteration of an era that's doing interesting content and technical things with the show.
Right on.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I'm someone who came up in musical theater, and a lot of this felt like how you have to learn to move on stage when you're moving from one side to the other, and you have to create a sense of a completely different location or a different time of day. And the way that that can happen in very strategic, very efficient, but very curated, choreographed moves, and to then activate these different spaces so that you get a sense that you are in a different place and you have the intimacy of that. Because Sean, I think you're so right that our proximity to Bad Bunny was very notable here in such a way that it felt, at least as the viewer, like he wanted you to feel like he was talking to you. And he says as much in a moment of like, my name is Benito Ocasio, and if I'm here, it's because I believed in myself, and you should believe in yourself too. You're worth more than you think you are, right? And that's almost this like, you need to manifest, but also take this mantra that I am giving to you, individual viewer, which I think was also an intentional move to create this sense of proximity and then invite you in. And this is where like Bad Bunny is nothing if not consistent. And he's been uncompromising in the way that he has been committed to representing his identity, his community, the sort of larger cultural history of Puerto Rico in relationship to the United States. But also this sense of like, let me invite you into my home, into the casita. And that was also part of him having this 31 show residency in Puerto Rico that was both about how do I not make populations more vulnerable to the violence of
Sure.
ICE and the federal government, as much as I think it is also about come to Puerto Rico. Like, I'm inviting you, come party in my home. And he delivered the party that he had promised us leading up to this. In that way. But I do think that there are interesting parallels, similarities that we could think about between Dr. Dre's and Friends show, which was in 2022 at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, and Bad Bunny, because they're not just creating sets on the field different than like Rihanna levitating on this
Sure.
airborne platform, but of those set pieces being so specific to childhood histories, cultural histories, so that you have Tan's Burgers, you have Eve's After Dark, you have the Compton Courthouse being mapped onto Compton for Dr. Dre and Friends in this way that's talking about the importance of Compton to the musical genre of hip hop and the importance of Compton to the musical legacy of somebody like Dr. Dre. And I think you see that with Bad Bunny, both of the way that Puerto Rico is mapped and the histories of sugarcane, et cetera, but then also these touch points that are about the broader diaspora. I'm in Los Angeles. Folks in Los Angeles were very, very happy to see Via's Tacos as one of the taco stands of like, oh, wait, that's an actual, we go to that taco stand. And so that sort of recognition, or the social club
Sure. From New York.
From New York.
Yeah.
And so I think he's also, and that's where I said well informed of, like, I think he recognizes that these may not have been the places he went to growing up, but these are the places that are part of this larger conversation with this diaspora that he is wanting to highlight, and also is in conversation with, thinking about, this larger question of America and diaspora, that I think was also a through line.
Yeah, it sort of manages to be kind of global, or at least hemispheric, as well as really, really kind of granular. This particular taco stand, this particular place in New York, and also historical. I mean, I thought having the Ricky Martin sing those lines from the No Pasa in No Pasa in Hawaii. I forget how I'm botching the Spanish title, but that particular kind of anti-colonial part of that song, and you have someone like Ricky Martin, who is already kind of seen as a kind of elder statesman in the in American music. So, what did you make of having Lady Gaga just sort of randomly show up and sing her song in the middle of it? I was kind of confused about that particular moment.
And I loved it. I thought, I was not expecting it. She's not somebody that I had on any of my bingo cards of potential guests for Bad Bunny. I do know he's had a long affinity for Lady Gaga. I think as a fellow artist, as a music lover, he is a fan of Lady Gaga. I think folks have had lots of think pieces have been like, well, it's inviting her in, of sort of asking Lady Gaga to do the work of crossing over, of altering and recomposing her song to fit that, rather than sort of this reverse crossover move that I think we are more familiar with, especially in American music industries, of like this idea of crossing over is sort of a necessary step for non-American artists to become recognized as global, even if they have like incredible global fan bases. It's like this framing of, until you are recognized by American English speaking audiences, that you are not yet a global star. And so I think that crossing over, and I will leave Courtney to speak to crossover as an analytic, but I think that's you say like crossover artists, we use that to talk about artists switching genres, of someone like Taylor Swift going to country to pop, but we also use it to speak to non-English speaking or non-American artists crossing over into the American music industry. And I think Bad Bunny, especially hot off of his Album of the Year Grammy win for an album entirely in Spanish, is really challenging those expectations, to Courtney's point, about what what is necessary in order for an artist to quote unquote make it and be recognized within particular industry spaces and media spaces. And so I do think that there's something about Lady Gaga as being joyful. I mean, to have Lady Gaga be your house band at your wedding that's
Sure.
happening on a Bad Bunny Super Bowl stage.
Yeah.
There's a joyousness there. But she's not somebody that I had anticipated seeing. And I will say it is common practice across, especially the more contemporary, what we think of as pop star halftime performers, of folks having featured guests, sometimes pre-announced, oftentimes it sort of is like who will be the one that's invited. But I also think, Bad Bunny is somebody, and this is absolutely no shade to Ricky Martin, who I love, or Lady Gaga, who I adore, but Bad Bunny didn't need either of these artists
No.
to do this show. So I think that he was, again, being very intentional, Ricky Martin, of the elder statesman term, if you will, as an artist who himself had to do this crossover
Exactly.
work and had to wrangle and wrestle with his identity, particularly his queer identity, with around different sets of expectations. And so I'll leave it to Courtney to sort of pick up. But I was surprised to see her, but I do think that it was about Bad Bunny also wanting to elevate music that has given him joy or inspiration as an artist as well.
I have this idea I use sometimes with actors and musical artists, especially. And I say, you're in your house money moment. And there's moments where people really had to work to think about audience, appeal, branding, all these things, right? You work and you build this platform. And then you can tell when someone's in their house money era, where they're like, an actor does this cool indie movie because they already made the Marvel money somewhere else, right?
Sure,
You're in your
sure.
house money moment where you can really pursue passion projects and things that drive you. And you don't have to worry about reception. You don't have to worry about if people get it, right? Bad Bunny has said in interviews, he doesn't care if people don't know what he's saying because they haven't taken the time to learn Spanish. He's like, that's on them. If they just enjoy the music, that's great. But if they're able to get the deeper meaning, the political messaging, et cetera, even better, right? But he's like, that's not my concern, right? And so when I think about this idea of who has to cross over and when is the right moment, I also think about Lady Gaga. People are like, he could have brought up out another Latin artist. This was a missed opportunity. And I'm like, or he's in a house money moment, right? Where he's in the midst of the best week of his life. And he's like, I just love Lady Gaga. What if I brought, like part of it is like, there are ways people want to find these deeper meanings, but I go to the house money moment of like Bad Bunny saying, I'm going to make this really intentional album that is going to be well-researched, that's going to bring these genres of music to the forefront, that's going to bring the Afro-Latin tradition into this space. And I kind of just love it being like, if folks know the viral Grammy moment of Lady Gaga coming up behind Bad Bunny and he kind of like swoons. Now that moment has so much more meaning because they've been rehearsing for the halftime show together, right?
Yeah.
And so when he's asked in an interview what she said to him, she said, I just love you. I love you. And and they're like, oh my gosh, Lady Gaga just came to you and said, I love you. But imagine if you're a little monster. Imagine if this is an artist that you've adored that has really been a model for you of like thriving in pop music, but also having a message, also being political. What if you have the moment, you finally get this moment, you're like, I'm bringing up my fave, right? Like, what if it's that? What if it's a house money moment that can be just about, wow, I'm going to have this moment that myself 10 years ago, 15 years ago, couldn't even have imagined. And so there's something cool about that, where when I see people making their house money album or starring in their house money movie, I'm kind of like, what would my house? It's kind of inspiring to think about, like, yes, it's cool to see Benito give baby Benito his Grammy, right? There's a visual element of that, but like, what is that in practice for us? Who would we collaborate with or write with, in our world, or who would we have an event with? Like, I think it's inspiring to think about what our house money moment could or would look like.
I would just, if I can add on
real
quick to that, because one thing, I say Lady Gaga was not on the list of like who potential folks that she might bring up, but Lady Gaga is actually the person that I had talked about most in interviews and conversations with folks leading up to Bad Bunny. Because I got a lot of questions from folks saying, like, is there precedent? Like, who should we look to of the controversy surrounding? And for me, it's like people were thinking about Kendrick Lamar's halftime show from last year, from 2025, and the sort of overtly political statement storytelling that he was doing with his stage. Or folks would think back to Beyonce, and Beyonce is a featured guest of Coldplay's halftime show in 2016. But for me, it was like Lady Gaga's, not the performance itself, but the anticipation leading up to Lady Gaga's performance felt very similar to the energy, to the think pieces, to the hot takes leading up to Bad Bunny. And I think part of that is they are two artists who have been very vocal, very visible in their allyship, in their stance for particular political movements, for particular marginalized populations. And so that is as much a part of their persona as is their star power as incredible music artists. And I don't think that expectation was the same, certainly of Beyonce prior to that performance, and not of Kendrick either, in the same ways. And so a lot of the conversations, I was like, this feels a lot like 2017 or late 2016 when folks were like, what's Gaga going to do? Is Gaga going to do this, have this huge LGBTQIA overt statement? And then the way she was read was trying to, back to Courtney's question on expectations, like use that as the metric of like, did she or didn't she? Was it political? Wasn't it political? But I think the conversations around anticipation felt similar this time to Lady Gaga. So it was sort of full circle moment to then see her be the one who's on the stage with him.
Yeah, that is full circle, and obviously we haven't mentioned the fact that there was this other part of the anticipation was about this other kind of alternative halftime show, this Turning Point event, which kind of looked like less of a concert, more like a knockoff episode of American Idol. But which I guess made Gabby Barrett was an American Idol performer, so I guess she kind of felt right at home. But what else did you notice about that show, and particularly as a sort of supposed entry into the genre of halftime shows? Like they had some fire, I guess, but I don't know that it was fire.
I think there's something really interesting. The Super Bowl is this fascinating event that people who have not, it's the season finale of a show that a lot of people didn't watch throughout its season, right? So,
Sure.
like, people that did not watch the NFL all season, have no idea about the storylines, show up at the season finale, and then they gather around this space. And then we have a concert in the middle. Like, it's the concept of the Super Bowl and watching the commercials. We complain about commercials all year. People pay extra to avoid them on their streaming platforms, and yet that is also a centerpiece. So this kind of ode to American excess and consumption happens every year, and you don't have to know what's going on or the players, and it's just this thing we gather around and eat a lot of carbs, and we do this thing, right? So the concept of the Super Bowl as this very American thing, it's playing, it's on sometimes in the background, sometimes people are very focused depending on what kind of Super Bowl gathering you're attending. So the idea that people watched one half of the Super Bowl and then turned to YouTube to watch whatever that was, and then turned back to the game. I don't know how often that happened. As I'm seeing a lot of conservative reaction, backlash, meltdowns, which we can absolutely talk about. Megyn Kelly is not okay right now. Part
of it
is like,
never been really. When was the last time she was okay?
I couldn't point to it, but I feel like I'm seeing that reaction to Bad Bunny. I'm not seeing them loving on the Kid Rock and Friends show, right? So there's something interesting about this expectation, especially that, mere hours before this Turning Point alternative aired, the All-American, All-Family, Faith Family Football production, that X is like, there's copyright violations. This will not be streaming on X. Then it's like, it's on YouTube. But I think part of it is even just the organization of it, to Perry's point, is about this anticipation of like, this will be a divisive show. This will be something that is not family friendly, which goes back to a lot of the language that had been leveraged towards Shakira and J-Lo's performance. And this idea of an all-American show, which I think no doubt Bad Bunny said, oh, heard, let's do, what is our sense of
Yeah.
all
What is all
America?
American? Yeah. Yeah.
And so we have this production value, and there are folks I would love within cinema and media studies to kind of give us a language around what I call the conservative aesthetic, which is a certain kind of stumbling kind of approach to design. I think about that with MAGA hats, the size and shape of the hats, the embroidery. There's a certain kind of aesthetic. And so I think about what that means as translated to a production value that then is going to go onto YouTube. And as you know, we're on YouTube. Doing live streams is not easy, in particular, the logistics of getting things right, making sure it looks and resembles what it should be like. Same with the halftime show. There's thousands of people in the actual stadium, but it's really made for this larger broadcast. And so I'm going to speak mostly to the production value of like thinking about this show that was kind of mushed together, who they were able to find. Comedians have been very funny about the lineup. You can see some great stand-up. I'm thinking about like, there are all these celebrities that claim that they voted for Trump. They couldn't get Nicki Minaj, they couldn't get Waka Flocka Flame, they couldn't get these other people, right? And so the selection of the artists, the abrasive backdrop, not even to say like the quality of the music itself and the musical value as it's translated and streamed to us, is something that I think is really interesting as this alternative. Who is tuning into this? Do people want to hate Bad Bunny more than they want to love on these artists, right? So I think about the idea of even the discourses we have online, how sometimes folks, and this is not just related to far right wing folks, it happens on the left as well, but people that are so looking for a reaction and looking to hate something more than understanding or maybe even being uncomfortable, or, you know, the idea of disgust as this valuable currency online seems to be the thing that is moving the right now more than supposedly celebrating their folks that did this one show with this weird stage.
Well, and there was I was thinking about, as you guys were talking about crossover, I was thinking about the fact that it opened with a kind of knockoff Jimi Hendrix Star Spangled Banner guitar performance. And then in the second song that Brantley Gilbert, who's like the first performer, like all the verses are rapped. Like it's all this sort of weird rap country hybrid. And he uses terms like hood to talk about his sort of dirt road anthem, and living in his country town is his hood. And then obviously Kid Rock is kind of cribbing from all sorts of kind of black culture, especially in his totally lip synced performance of his like 1990s hit. But he's introduced by, and I couldn't see who they were. They're sort of four black guys who are dressed in what appears to be kind of I guess it's supposed to be like hip hop garb, talking about him being their homie. And so there's this crossover there too, which is very strange. And also it's kind of, I wonder how many decades it takes for black music to become all American. Suddenly this is all American. So anyway, there's some crossover there too.
Yeah. That last point I think is like a whole other conversation about black music is American music.
Absolutely.
In so many ways that yes, we could certainly talk for days on that. I mean, I think you're both right in the sense of the production value itself. It felt very like CMT or like mega church broadcast in a way, but they were trying to, they were in a studio with I think a couple hundred people. They weren't trying to recreate the context. They were trying to give us an alternative, and they said as much. But I think Courtney's right that part of why we're not hearing that show celebrated, at least in what I've read and been exposed to, is celebrated in the same ways, is because it wasn't about their selection of artists per se. It was about the fact that it was anybody who wasn't Bad Bunny. And I think that they, in some ways, made that very clear even before the artists were announced. When they first announced that they were going to do this, a simultaneous alternative halftime show, and they offered folks the opportunity to go to their website, give them their email, and then select from a checklist of like, not who, but what would you like to hear at the alternative halftime show? And the first checkbox was anything in English, right?
Yeah.
So they're not actually looking for a specific storyline or narrative. It's more just like, as long as it is not this other that we are dividing ourselves against. And so that sense of oppositional framing, I think, played out with this show. But it is a new little entry into an attempt to pull attention away for the sake of divisiveness, right? That is part of what is being deployed strategically, at the same time as they're saying that what's happening with Bad Bunny is the divisive act.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the it's like Fox News and a bunch of other kind of right-wing commentators talk about how successful this program was, and how it drew all these people away. And there's been and I've even seen some podcasters trying to say that there's evidence that more people watch the Turning Point. And like none of this it's completely ludicrous.
Mhm.
But I guess we now have the official numbers: 128 million viewers for the Bad Bunny halftime show in the cast in the live broadcast. 3 million of whom seem to have joined the broadcast just to watch the show. Like it was that was an increase from the second half. And then the Turning Point evidently peaked at 6 million viewers for the live
Mhm.
broadcast, which we don't need to do too much math here. And its YouTube recording has peaked at 20 million, while Bad Bunny's YouTube recording is now up to almost 70 million, and it just kind of keeps growing. Um, so, but on the other hand, it's like these comparisons have become this sort of index, not really about the quality of these shows or how popular the programs were, but a sort of referendum on what American society believes today. So, I mean, and maybe the Lady Gaga is the earlier moment, but what have you been looking at since this show, and maybe even before? Like, how does this sit with the way that the Super Bowl operates culturally, historically? Like how often does it become this kind of referendum on what people believe, what they want to line up with?
Yeah, I think it has been a stage that has always been political, always already been political. And even when the choices have been seemingly sort of tempered or mundane, that process of selection itself is sort of the point at which politics
And is that true
enters.
even all the way back in the 80s or the 70s? Is this that for that long has it been political?
Yeah, very early iterations of the Super Bowl halftime show were much more localized, where you get marching bands or drill teams from local high schools, local universities. So there was a local um, suturing that happened in ways that we just don't really have anymore. I mean, the fact that Dr. Dre and friends were performing in LA was sort of a rarity. It was also part of why people really critiqued Kendrick over folks like Lil Wayne in New Orleans, because there's also these expectations of like, oh, if it's in a city that has a rich musical history, why are we not pulling
Mhm.
from the sort of legacy of those artists who are performing? So that's always been a kind of conversation that what happens, and it gets activated in different ways. But you can look back even to the sort of performance troupe Up With People that sort of came to rise in the 1960s and has performed more than any other group at the Super Bowl halftime show, although it's
Really?
been many years. That they were in some ways a troupe that originated in an attempt to provide an alternative to what was seen as more errant youth culture, or often framed as hippie culture during the period of the late 1960s. And then you have Up With People being this very buttoned up, very modest, very sort of presentable, and certain normative ideas around what adolescence should be. That part of why that troupe was deployed in the way that it was, both on the Super Bowl halftime show stage, but also as like in USO tours and in diplomacy tours on behalf of the United States around the world, was to put forward this image of what it means to be a good American and a good citizen. So even in those shows, which you watch back and they look very, I don't know what the nice way to say it is. They're modest cute, quaint little things. But the decision for them to be on that stage was itself a political one in order to push forward a particular idea of what America should be. And that was like, American presidents were involved in some of those decisions around promoting some of these groups that then would be selected by the NFL. So Courtney, you may have others that you want to highlight.
Yeah, I was thinking Gulf War era and kind of both. Sometimes the actual news, political cut in, we have a live news bulletin. And then sometimes it's about it's, we already have a show couched in like flyovers and all of the other kinds of nationalistic kind of visuals. But then we also have, in the 90s, these salute to America kind of shows where we have children of members of the armed forces are centered. We have the folks watching, which creates a new template of folks watching from around the world at different bases. So the kind of semblance of empire that's brought in, right? But we don't call, that's not the framing that we're hearing as like political, but it is so in your face political when we think about the expectations. Again, when people say, why can't the Super Bowl halftime show be like it used to? Why did Jay-Z ruin it? They're hearkening back to those shows as these templates. The last thing I'll say about reaction from the right when it comes to Bad Bunny is also really interesting to me that, again, when you give those numbers on who watched what, and we think about voting practices in the last presidential election, it's really interesting that a lot of those folks that voted for Trump absolutely watched Bad Bunny. And we don't have any kind of qualitative data on their preferences or what fueled that decision. But what I find interesting, I'll use Laura Loomer as an example, a very conservative, right-wing kind of outspoken person. And she had this tweet that I think has gone since fairly viral, where she posts part of the clip. So she is reposting part of Bad Bunny's performance when he is on the actual power, like the light poles, right?
Sure.
And she says, and I quote, I have it here, "It's kind of ironic how Bad Bunny was dancing on an electrical post at the Super Bowl halftime show. Puerto Rico isn't exactly known for having reliable electricity. He could have highlighted the electrical grid crisis in PR and done some good with his platform, but he chose degeneracy." So I want to think about, even when we have these overtly political kinds of understandings where the entire song is about that. That is the song that is playing. That is the visuals that he put it. So even when we are being handheld towards a strong anti-colonial political statement about how the US has completely abandoned Puerto Rico, we were right there. We were so close. We were right there. And so I think about who defines these things as political, who defines these as the right ways to show any kind of resistance. And so I also just think about who gets to define what is inherently political or the right kind of politic to have. So even when it's there, it's right there. It's often, to go back to our fave, it's often built into these kinds of ways that meanings are encoded and decoded. That's what Stuart Hall is telling us. So I think about that as like the political of, like, some people may have watched Up with People and not kind of understood that as a response to the 60s. It's a response to a heightened kind of moment of movement building and political resistance, but it's there. It is there for us. And so these multiple readings also become important.
I hadn't seen that tweet. That's pretty astounding. Talk about the decoding problem. I mean, I also, one of the other pieces that I read, and I'd be interested to know if there's another kind of think piece that sort of stands out to you, but that in the Atlantic, David Graham did a piece talking about the overlaps between these two shows, right? That there is a sort of common set of themes about, for one, the importance of marriage. It comes up in both, and we actually have a real wedding at Bad Bunny's. But hardworking Americans, the authenticity of their everyday culture, mistreatment by elites, and some sort of patriotic loyalty to something called America. Now, I think certainly there's a broader set of ideas in Bad Bunny. And as he put it, Bad Bunny even danced on the top of a pickup truck, which is a visual that would have worked perfectly for any of the Turning Point performers if they hadn't been playing on a dark industrial sound stage. So I don't know. I don't know if there's any other overlaps that you could see there. But I do think there's that's one thread, or other think pieces that you think are useful for kind of framing this.
Right. If we did a bingo board and I asked you who was going to say God bless America, right? Like if we think about like
Sure.
if we just provided the context devoid of any visual, who's going to say God bless them? Who's going to end their show with a God bless America moment?
Okay.
What who do we think would do that? Right. So part of it is like this is also about the expectations, right? And
Sure.
being able to flip these things on its head. Okay, but when I say America, let me list the Americas that we're talking about here. And so when we think about who's going to use the flag in some kind of way, right? And so thinking about knowing what the expectations were, knowing these narratives and flipping that, right? So think how these critiques of class or like this idea of who the elites are. And it's not lost on me this is happening if we go to Bad Bunny's performance in a place where nosebleed tickets are like half of my rent for the year, right?
Yeah.
With that, this is happening in front of the kinds of folks that can afford to go to the Super Bowl. This is happening in this thing, but it's also happening for all of us that are watching at home, right? And so I think there's something really interesting about this so-called divide between this idea of two Americas and Bad Bunny being like, actually, there's way more. I'll actually read them all out for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what it means to think about who is dividing us and when.
Right.
And so I think when I'm hearing from one of the turning point performers came out and said, I didn't choose to do this to be divisive. And I was like, oh, well, you chose to do this show. So I think some of the framings and discourses about what performing in one show versus the other means also does this big, heavy work, right? But meanwhile, there are also the actual lived realities, whether we're talking about folks in Puerto Rico or we're talking about folks in my home state of Texas, right? And so part of it is like these are heavy representational moments where millions of people have watched both of these shows. But I think what I'm interested in this particularly fraught moment is where we go from here, right? People are still watching this show. It was 17 million folks that had watched the Bad Bunny YouTube when I woke up Monday. You said now it's over 70.
It's over 70, and it just sort of keeps growing. That's about
Yeah.
right. It was like 1 million an hour afterwards, or 5 hours afterwards, and then it just keeps going up.
Yeah. And it may be true also for folks that watched Bad Bunny live and then they go back and watch the Turning Point show. Like these things will grow, but I think I'm interested if we move past the kind of representational politics, which I think are very important, especially in this moment. But like, what does this mean on the ground, right?
Mhm.
What does it mean for the lived reality? There's really cool things. People are going to go visit a taco stand or a social club that they heard about. Those businesses, I mean, they got the best Super Bowl commercial ever, right? For
Yeah.
free. And so I think about that of like, what is that resisting when we have this halftime show couched in between AI commercials, GLP-1s, cryptocurrency, sports gambling. This is what the reality of like where we are. Like the show is telling us where we are in this country and others. What does it mean to have him climb these electric poles in a moment where these data centers, I live not too far from one, are not only taking all of our energy, but also creating really environmental hazards in, already marginalized communities of color, right? So I think it's like there's the visual kind of friction or these frictions that Perry was talking about, but there's also like when we turn our TVs off, when we rewatch Bad Bunny or we go watch the Turning Point show, the actual lived realities are this is so vivid to how the everyday life feels. And maybe that's why we keep going back to it, is it's like maybe it gives us a moment of joy, but it also gives us a really great temperature check of where we are, not just within the halftime show or these shows, plural, but in the game itself, the NFL, in the people that attend the game, in the commercials. Like, I just feel like this is such a great kind of checkpoint of where we are. The question is, we have to figure out the rest of this year before the next Super Bowl halftime show, where do we want to go? What does this actually mean for us in terms of our lived reality?
I would just add to that. I mean, it's I co-sign everything that Courtney just said, but this article that you shared of doing this comparison of like, well, these weren't this dissimilar if we looked at these sort of these symbols or these moments that are happening, which doesn't feel unique to this particular moment, and I think speaks to these broader practices of, whether we go back to encoding or decoding, or the way the discursive framing sets up of like, okay, we're both saying God bless America, but that means really different
Sure.
things, and the sort of definitional work that Bad Bunny is doing. He's like, just in case you weren't clear on what I meant by that, here we go.
Yeah.
Where the other, they're not doing that same definitional work per se, but there's so much insinuated of like, when we say America, we mean the United States of America. And when we mean the United States of America, we mean this version, right? And so it's the way that semantics are also deployed as sort of a word play that can both be subversive, but also sort of reify these outdated traditional,
Sure.
historically normalized hierarchies of power and practices of othering that Bad Bunny was playing with to open up new avenues for possibility and lay claim to what's also already always been there, where the other was sort of just regurgitating kind of tired lines around this. I mean, Variety framed it as a boring MAGA grift. Another headline was like, it was a weird little event, a MAGA stunt bowl, right? It wasn't celebrated for its production or musical value. And Kid Rock is somebody who was performed on the Super Bowl halftime stage. He was in one of those mashups, right? It wasn't a Kid Rock headline show, but he did perform in sort of that MTV era. And when he performed, he wore an American flag that he had modified to have as a shirt. And he got backlash in that moment because folks said that he was desecrating the American flag. So it's just an interesting moment that now he is the banner of the All-American in the way that Turning Point USA is framing it.
Yeah, I don't think they actually had there was no physical flag at that event. It's all digital and kind of cut up, which there's something I think interesting about that. It's you just a bunch of stars, mostly black background and white stars. So I'm not sure what all that says, but um, well, I'm sure that you all could talk about this for another 2 or 3 hours. And we don't have the FCC complaints yet, but I'm sure those will be coming out soon. Uh, but I understand you're going to be doing some appearances to talk about your forthcoming book because you have a whole book that you've put together on not just this halftime show, but all of them, right? You looked at all of them. Is that
Yeah. So we're currently working on that book. Now there feels like a lot of urgency because it seems like people want to really dig into this stuff. I think one of the things that we think about in our work, whether we're not thinking about this as this chronological kind of understanding and reading, as we have kind of talked about, as you might have guessed, we think about it really thematically. So
sure?
whether we're thinking about the brands that are invested in the Super Bowl halftime show success, the production and kind of the behind the scenes on that front, the ways that identity, specifically gender, have moved through this. Obviously, Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson. We talk about FCC. We think about that as kind of a key component to not just how we understand the halftime show, but how we understand media and communication and its relationship to regulation at the federal level. Like that has been a game changer. And so we kind of try to unpack a cultural history of the Super Bowl halftime show, thinking about these themes: nationalism, the idea of the nation. What does it mean to have U2 perform after 9/11, right? A non-American band that is supposed to represent the nation and where we are in a particular moment. So we think about it thematically. If you're into that kind of stuff, we are cooking something up on that front. And this fall, we'll also have an edited collection where we have contributors from around the world that are thinking about the intersection of music, sound, and sport. And so the other way is the halftime show is perhaps the most visible version of that collision, but there are many others. And so we're so glad to have athletes, musicians, cultural critics, scholars, all in conversation together to kind of think through different case studies, different ways that this has happened, both past and present.
Great. And I understand you also have your book isn't a new book, the double crossover, but you're doing some appearances on that. Is that true? Is this another book you're working on and heading on tour?
Yeah. Yeah, so my book, Double Crossover, Gender, Media, and Politics in Global Basketball, came out last year. And it really charts 10 years of field work following women's basketball players around the world, and thinking through labor, thinking through media, and thinking through how they have to negotiate a lot of this across borders constantly. And so that book came out last year, kind of in the start around the start of last year's WNBA season. And so I'll be continuing to think about that, whether it's in Athletes Unlimited, which is in Nashville this season, which is across this month. I'll be doing talks both virtually and in person coming up here. You can find out more on my socials. I'm happy to share that in some kind of show note format.
Sure.
And so I'll continue that through. We'll hit March Madness right after that. Maybe there'll be a WNBA season, still working through some CBA stuff. And so I think it's a great time for us to have a moment to think about what these new openings within the sport mean. And I'm really excited to talk about it in some events coming up.
Great. And Perry, your book is still in process, yes? You're
Still in
still
process. Yeah, my solo book is looking at a cultural history of misconduct in the American music industry, thinking largely about how structures of power, since it was formalized as an institution at the turn of the 20th century, have contributed to the just disproportion of abuse in that industry that we've heard little bits about, but really haven't gotten the full picture. So I'm attempting to map that out with a cultural history and a database that is logging publicly disclosed incidents.
Wow. That sounds heavy. Well, good luck with that, and good luck with all of your appearances and the new book. Thanks so much for joining us again. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. We will keep an eye out for those FCC comments, and in the meantime, good luck with these appearances that are coming up.
Thank you.
Our show next Wednesday on February 18th will once again be a little later in the day to accommodate our speakers' schedules. At 3 p.m. Chicago time, we'll continue our discussion of politics and the culture of sports when we host Ali Rocher, Dr. Anna Baith, and the Chris Mosier to talk about their new book, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. There will be a different registration link, but if you're joining us on YouTube, it'll be streaming here again. This episode will also be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel. If you have ideas about future episodes or invitees, email us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com and like, share, subscribe, send the video out. And thanks again to you all for joining us. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at Breaking Culture Live or breakingculture.substack.com. Until next time, take care.